Okay, I think we're all good to go. Good morning, everyone. My name is Deb Fuster. Contrary to the typo in my little box in the Zoom chat there, or the Zoom box there. So Deb Fuster, I'm the Manager of Advocacy and Engagement at the Victorian Council of Social Service. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we all meet on Aboriginal land, that sovereignty was never ceded, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal people who are on the call today as well. So thanks for joining us this morning. I think we've actually got an incredibly high attendance, which is fantastic. Essentially, just a little bit of background to this event, the Renters' Rights Rundown. As many as you know, the Victorian Government has embarked on an ambitious rent reform agenda, and that includes both long-awaited market-wide reforms, which are due to commence in 2021, as well as the emergency measures that were implemented as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So the Rent Relief Grant, which you'll find out more about today, is one of the temporary emergency measures in place to provide financial support to Victorian renters. Many people in this webinar support clients with renting issues, and so we're running this session and more like it to give you the most up-to-date information about renting laws and support so that you can share that with your clients. A little bit of webinar housekeeping. I'll soon introduce one of the teams from the newly established Homes Victoria. That team is going to give a presentation on the Rent Relief Grant, but a big part of our session today is time for question and answers. So before we begin, I'll let you know how the Q&A will work, just in case some questions come up during the presentation and you want to ask them as they come to mind. So a few points, comments and questions will be moderated, and that's only to ensure that we can get to as many issues as possible. It's also important to note that the DHHS team from Homes Victoria won't be able to answer questions about specific circumstances or grant applications. We'll keep it fairly high level around the implementation of the grant and any questions you have about that. To ask a question or to make a comment, you have two options. You can click the Q&A little chat box there, the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window, and type your question into that box. And you can select whether to send your question to panelists only or to everyone in the webinar. The other option is that you can click Ask Question Live, and our host will get your mic and camera working so you can ask your question as close to face-to-face as it gets in this virtual environment. So you have two options. And finally, because this is one of the many sector briefings that VCOSS is hosting about the rent reforms, we've got a couple of survey questions that we'd love to ask you, we'd love you to answer. They will pop up on your screen when you leave the webinar. And if you could please take a moment to answer this survey, that information will really help us know what the community sector wants to know about the rent reforms, and it will help shape really targeted future events that you'll derive a lot of value from. So please take a moment if you can to answer those survey questions when they pop up on your screen at the end. So that's probably enough for me, from me for now. I'm going to hand over to our colleagues at DHHS. So I'd like to introduce a few people to you. Firstly, may I introduce Mayor Ramakrishnan, also Alex Dordovich and Brittany Clark from Strategic Housing Policy. They are now at the newly established Homes Victoria, and the team is going to take us through the Rent Relief Grant. Over to you, Mayor and team. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Deb, and good morning, everyone. Before we start, I'd also like to commence by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal people who might be here today. I'd like to acknowledge and respect the ongoing culture of the Aboriginal peoples, which is the longest living in human history, and acknowledge that these lands have never been ceded. As Deb said, we're really excited to be here today to take you through the COVID Rent Relief Grants scheme, and we've got a presentation to go through, but I'll spend some time on it, but not too much, so we've got enough time for really a discussion, question and answer, and also feedback that people might have around the program and how it's running. Before I jump into our slides, I think it would be remiss of me to not mention the government's investment announcement from Sunday, the big housing build, which was a $5.3 billion investment into social and affordable housing, and also as part of that announcement of our new entity, Homes Victoria. We're pretty excited about that investment into the social and affordable housing system as a key plank of Victoria's housing response. And if people are interested in more information, I'd direct them to vic.gov.au, and there's a link there to Homes Victoria, and you can find out more about the package, and there's a contact sort of line there that if people have got questions, they can submit them formally through that channel. So I thought it was worth just calling that out, because I think there's a range of supports in the system at the moment, and obviously the government announcement from the weekend is a big step, generational change really in the housing system. But today is about another program that the Victorian government has got live at the moment, which is the COVID rent relief grants. And if we flick to the first slide, I thought it might be helpful to give people a bit of an overview about the sort of journey to get us to this point, and a bit of a sense of the objectives of the program, and also some information about the criteria by which we assess applications to access the scheme. So really, discussion about the rent relief grants kind of goes back to the start of 2020 in our first wave of COVID, amidst a lot of national cabinet discussions around a range of matters in the context of COVID and the social and economic impacts of the pandemic. One of the things that people would be aware of that was discussed at that level was action by states, territories and the Commonwealth on commercial tenancies and residential tenancies. And there were some principles put in place around residential tenancies, but it was really around left to states and territories to establish what the appropriate housing response would be in the context of their state. So back in April, there were a range of measures that the Victorian government announced in the context of residential tenancies to better support people that are in the market. There were legislative changes that were introduced, notably an evictions moratorium and a rent freeze, which continues at the moment. There was introduction of a new dispute resolution scheme through Consumer Affairs Victoria. We were hoping that someone from CAV would be able to join us, but unfortunately they weren't able to make it. But I know that people might have questions there, so we're happy to take some questions on notice on that aspect and come back to people. And then of course there were the COVID rent relief grants, which were announced on the 15th of April, which was really around supporting renters in the rental market who are experiencing hardship as a result of COVID, and to give them direct financial assistance to maintain their tenancies during this pandemic time. Really three key objectives as they're laid out on the slide. So to provide financial assistance in response to the state of emergency, really encourage landlords and tenants to come together to get to a rent reduction agreement, and I'll go to this when we get to the next slide. And from the renter's perspective, really avoid accumulation of rent-related debts, which compound financial hardship or debt issues that particular renters might already be experiencing. Back in April, when the scheme was announced, it was put out with a maximum grant amount of $2,000. That has subsequently been increased to $3,000 in recognition of the circumstances of renters in the current Victorian market, but also it was increased when Victoria went into the next stage of restrictions and recognition that the pandemic and its response was continuing for longer than originally anticipated when the scheme was first introduced. That's a bit of an overview of the history and the objectives of the scheme. So if we go to the next slide, this details a little bit more about the eligibility criteria. So again, there's been a few changes along the way as the pandemic has unfolded in our state. Originally, I think the program was due to be rolled up in September. Obviously, that didn't happen because of the situation for COVID. So the grant scheme is open until the end of March, which coincides with when the emergency measures in the RTA legislation are likely to come to end, and when the RTAA comes into effect. In terms of our targeting of the grant scheme, there's everyone can read it on the slide, but just to step that through, the main eligibility criteria was that there was a financial impact as a result of COVID, that applicants are in financial hardship or rental hardship, and that's really assessed based on the calculation of 30% of their income, or over 30% of their income being paid towards rent, and that's that calculation is made after the rent reduction agreement has been put in place. There does need to be proof of a rent reduction agreement, so that consumer affairs process is effectively like a front door to the grant scheme. And then there was also targeting in relation to applicants' income and their cash or savings amount. The cash or savings amount is one aspect that changed in terms of the program design as we've gone through from April until now. So it used to be $5,000, but in recognition of the wider support that was needed in the market for renters, that was increased to $10,000. And then the last eligibility criteria is there's no PR or citizenship requirement, which we saw as a really key part of the program to reach some of the more vulnerable renters that might not be able to access some of the other supports that have been put in place. So that's the eligibility criteria. And then in terms of where people can find more information or get on to applying, if we go to the next slide, there's obviously the website information through housing.vic.gov.au. We have a phone line which is available, and there is also more information on the website to step through what the process looks like, Q&As, and also fact sheets that have been translated into a number of languages to try and widen the reach. We know that there are some harder to reach cohorts that we're really keen that this particular program gets to, and maybe we can get to this in the discussion later on, but we've tried to provide enough information through those channels to assist people. And importantly, a support agency is able to assist applicants in that process of applying for the rent relief grants. If we go to the next slide, just a bit of a synopsis about what we're seeing. So at the moment, the total grant amount paid to tenants is around 50. This is probably a couple of days old now, but just over $50 million has been paid out to applicants. And interestingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, the average grant amount is actually very close to the maximum grant amount. So that's showing that I think that indicates a level of rental hardship that is in the system at the moment. More than half of all tenants are in the cohort of 18 to 29 years of age. Be good to explore with people on this call why that might be. It could be because of more insecure employment, for example, through the COVID pandemic, but it also might be an indication of, what groups find the application process easier. So we're keen to make sure that that's not a barrier. Loss of employment has been the most common financial impact, and probably fair to say that in terms of the geographic split of applications, so City of Melbourne and City of Port Phillip have been the top LGAs, and there is a concentration within Metro Melbourne, and I think we've got an example of that on the map next, which I won't spend a lot of time on, except to say that there is a spread of applications, but there is a concentration within Metro Melbourne. So next slide, I think this brings me to the end of my spiel, but really keen to take questions from people, to hear about whether people accessing your services are aware of the grants, what we can do to break down any barriers that people are experiencing in terms of access, and any suggestions that you might have. So I'll turn myself back on mute, but open it up for questions and discussion. Deb, forgive me, I've already forgotten what our process was for this section, for this section of the session.
We're just unmuting, Deb. The next section is Q&A. It's Karen Taranto here from VCOSS. I'll just take this moment to ask that people use the Q&A box rather than the chat box to post your questions. That way we can just answer the questions in the order that they come in. That would be great. Thanks, everyone. I'll hand over to Deb now.
So sorry, I felt very, it's Deb Fuse to hear again. I felt very disempowered just then, unable to unmute myself and madly tapping messages into my phone. So thank you for your indulgence with the clunkiness of some of this, these online sessions, but we'll do our best. Now, as Karen said, if you could ideally use the Q&A box rather than the chat box. Karen and I are going to be working together to prioritise some of those questions, but while Karen starts to do a bit of moderation with the questions so we can just get to as many as possible, I might just randomly throw to a few that I can see in the Zoom chat. So one of the questions that I can see from Elise is, can couples each apply for the grant if they are both listed on the tenancy agreement?
I can answer that. So absolutely, as long as one of the couples is registered on the agreement, then we can calculate their eligibility and process the application.
Thank you. One of the other questions that I can see on there, so it's a question from C, and it's a question around the percentage of rent. And the question is there a way funding can be accessed without a rent reduction?
No, not really. So because this is a response to the COVID pandemic, the government kind of announced it with that really core eligibility criteria to try and get both landlords and tenants to come to the table initially to try and reach a rent reduction agreement before they can access the grant. So it is the kind of first step. Having said that, I think the government's not prescriptive about the level of reduction. So what we've been seeing roughly is around a 25% reduction through those rent agreements, but that's not mandatory to apply for the grant. So even if it was lower than that, as long as you've registered the agreement with Consumer Affairs Victoria, you're eligible for the grant.
Great, thank you. I've got a question here around how does it work? How does the rent relief work in share houses if not everyone in the share house is experiencing financial hardship?
Yep, people can still apply. So we will, you can either apply as a single person in a shared household, or let's say 2 or 3 people in a 4-person sharehold. The combination doesn't matter. We'll actually assess the person's eligibility based on their proportion of the rent, assuming that it's, if there are 4 people, then we'll assume they're paying 25% of the rent. If that's not the case, then they're paying a higher share, then they should add that into the text box in the application and we'll kind of access that. We've had quite a few shared households applying. I think the biggest is a 6-person shared household, but the average is generally 2 to 3 people in a shared household that have applied for the grant. And in some cases where they're all eligible for the grant and they all meet rental stress conditions, each of those applicants is eligible for a maximum of $3,000 grant each. So there have been circumstances where each person in a shared household has got the maximum grant based on their income and the level of rent that they're paying.
Thanks, Alex. Question from Jacinta Wenham. Is this for public and private rental?
That's a really, really good question, and it's often been asked. It's actually open to both people in social and community housing. However, very few people would meet the trigger of paying more than 30% of their income in rent. As you know, in public housing in particular, the maximum is 25% of income in rent, so they won't meet their threshold. sometimes in social housing, if people are paying market rents, then they may well be eligible. So we're not putting a blanket, you can't apply it, but they are going to have to meet all of those eligibility criteria.
Great, thank you. Some great questions here. A question from Sabina. The question starts with a comment, I'm assuming the grant is a one-off, i.e. if a client has received one 6 months prior, they cannot receive another in 2021.
That's a good comment as well. And at the moment, it is a one-time application per grant, but we'll be kind of reviewing that case if the grant continues beyond March the 28th.
Thank you. Great question from Antonia Glover at Justice Connect. Antonia's written in the Q&A, we know from our work at Justice Connect that there are challenges for people to understand eligibility as part of the rent reduction process, given that they can only apply after they've lodged a rent reduction agreement. And Antonia is asking, is there any way for people to provisionally confirm their eligibility whilst negotiating a rent reduction?
That's a really good question. I'm now just trying to recall if there is an eligibility calculator on our website. May or Brittany, can you recall? No, we're not exactly sure, but if we can perhaps take that on notice, because I'm pretty sure that we've got a ready reckoner just to see whether you'd be eligible based on those calculations, but I'm not sure if that's available on the website, so we'll take that on notice.
Thanks. Question from Stephanie Cohen, can the grants be retrospective?
That's a really good question too. I think, I'm not sure what's meant by retrospective, but as long as you've lost income as a result of COVID events since March, then you're theoretically eligible. So we basically look at your income at the time of application, as well as what you're paying in rent and your personal circumstances. So it could be that that you may have amassed some of the debt before the start of March, but the grant itself is payable for funds, or the rent that you're eligible to pay under the rent reduction agreement once it's negotiated.
Thank you. Question from Glenda Fraser at Launch Housing. What if your client is waiting for Centrelink benefits?
Just trying to think through the answer on that, Maya.
Yeah, I was just, it's hard with these virtual environments when you can't easily ask a question back. But I mean, I suppose if there's been a loss of income and that can be shown, then that doesn't preclude somebody applying for the grant. So if they're waiting and their income has dropped considerably and they meet the threshold for the 30% of income being paid on rent, then they can certainly apply.
Great, thank you. Question from Launch again, do you need proof of unemployment and reasons for termination?
Yeah, so during the application process, we just need you to verify why your income has dropped since the start of the event. So that will vary based on people's circumstances, but it could be a pay slip which has shown that your income has been dropped, or it could be a note from your employer that says you did work at 30 hours a week and now you're only working 15 hours a week. So the triggers are a 20% loss in income or a 20% drop in hours, I think.
Thank you. Question from Jacqueline Swan. When an application has been lodged and submitted, is there a way that it can be reviewed?
Reviewed or viewed. So if it needs to be reviewed, then you can contact that contact number that's available on the website. It's a 1300 or 1800 number, and you'll be able to update your details. If you're really wanting to know the status of your application, I think you contact the same number. There's also an email address if you're if you're really wanting to understand where the process is at.
Great, thank you. The questions are coming in thick and fast, so we've still got plenty of time left on this webinar, so thanks for your indulgence and patience as we make our way through them. Question from Ryan Nolan: do you have an estimate of how long a grant takes to be approved?
Yes, look, we had a huge demand in grants during September and October once the grants had increased to $2,000 to $3,000. So we're kind of working through that demand, but roughly about a month, I think we're aiming to get applications out, assessed and out of the door within 30 days. In some cases, it might be longer, and I would say that if it's causing any of your clients hardship, or there's delays that are being delays that have an effect on their ability to maintain the rent, that's an awful situation. We don't want that to happen. So I'd strongly recommend you or your applicant to contact our number and ask about where that application is. And if it's an urgent situation, we'll do everything we can to fast track that application.
Great, thank you. There's a question here from Heidi around the financial impact of domestic violence and family violence. We know that we're all concerned that there's been an increase in domestic violence and family violence across the trajectory of the pandemic. So a question about whether the financial impact is being kind of noted, acknowledged, considered by the team in assessing these grant applications.
It is, absolutely, and we're very conscious and aware of the extreme hardship that people experiencing family violence are experiencing, and we'll do everything we can to fast track that rent application. So if you or the applicant is in that situation, or that they're in that situation, please let us know, and we have kind of fast track and alternative mechanisms to deal with that. We have had some concerns about whether people's private information, if they're experiencing family violence, people's private information through the process could be compromised, and the person committing the abuse might somehow get that information. So we're very conscious and aware of that. But again, I would say contact our team direct if your client's experiencing family violence and needs special consideration, either in terms of timing or in terms of the sensitivity of their personal information. A really good question, thank you.
Thanks. We've had a few questions which I guess acknowledge the power imbalance between landlords and renters. So I'm going to ask a question from Emily Tasmarcus, which I think is representative of a few questions in the Q&A. So Emily's comment and question is, we work with people who are entering the rental market. Not sure it's likely the landlords will agree to a reduction directly after a lease has been signed. Is there a possible workaround for this?
So I might jump in on that. So absolutely recognise that there's a power imbalance that can exist in some of those landlord and renter relationships. As Alex mentioned, and I think in response to a previous question, the rent reduction agreement is a front door for us for the scheme, and so that is something that needs to be demonstrated for applicants to access the financial support. This is one where I think Consumer Affairs Victoria can play a role. So in the first instance, it might be that the first port of call is that the renter and the landlord tries to come to an agreement themselves. If that is not possible, we are directing people towards the CAV front door in terms of their dispute resolution scheme, and that has an escalating level of, I guess, formality to it, but they can help bring parties together, and that would be something that we'd encourage people to use. In saying that, we recognise that can be quite a difficult and perhaps daunting exercise for some renters, and we're happy to keep working with CAV and maybe come back on what can be done in that situation.
Thank you. Now, I know there's a few questions around asylum seekers. And I might just ask a couple of questions that I can see on there related to permanent residency, citizenship requirements, etc. So one of the questions from Zoe Evans from CISVIC is that given that there are no permanent residency or citizenship requirements, are people on bridging visas with no income at the moment ineligible?
Do you want to go ahead, Alex? What do you want?
Brittany, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we have been doing some work with support providers who are working with and representing people who are seeking asylum and those that are currently on bridging visas to raise awareness of the grants and also talk through the eligibility criteria in the application process, because we understand obviously these people are in particularly vulnerable situations, especially financially and in terms of at risk of homelessness. Unfortunately, at the moment, they are ineligible if they cannot meet the eligibility criteria of loss of income. So I would really encourage people who are working with people seeking asylum to look at other programs that the government is offering, like the extreme hardship program, and there's also some other financial assistance that I know our diversity team has been working on, and we can definitely distribute that to VCOSS to provide to members here who are working with people seeking asylum.
Thank you. Question from Georgie and Faisy from Community Information Services Moreland. What if people don't have an official tenancy agreement but the landlord knows they're living in the house? Are they able to access the grant?
Thanks, that's a really good question, and the answer is yes. So we recognise that there are a lot of informal lease arrangements that may not have gone through the Tenancies Bond Authority. In those cases, we'll just need proof between the landlord and the tenant that an accommodation exists, so either a letter or a statutory declaration that one exists. So absolutely, we do want to capture people in less formal arrangements. Having said that, we just want to make sure that there is actually a genuine accommodation relationship. So during the application process, we'll ask for some kind of confirmation, whether it's rental payments made through a bank account, just to prove that there is a rental relationship that exists.
Great, thank you. Now, question from Tao from Launch Housing, and sorry, there's a little bit of narrative around this one. So if I just read it out, the question is, I can't find any section on the website which clearly explains how the grant is calculated and used. My understanding is that it is used to cover the gap between 30% of the client's income and the reduced rent. And Tao says, I'm working with a tenant whose property manager said the grant is used to cover the gap between the original rent and the reduced rent. I directed the property manager to the website, but they are adamant that their information is correct. So a question about just a bit of an explanation around how the grant is calculated and used.
Yeah, and this is a question that's come up a few times with the grant, or when the grant has been announced. So in relation to Tao's position is the correct one in terms of it's a grant that is used to bring the rent payment down to 30% of income. It is not intended to bridge the gap between the original rent amount and the rent reduction agreed with the landlord. In terms of that should be available on the website, and I think probably the best point there should be Q&As on the website that go into that detail, but there are also operating guidelines that are on our website that will detail some of the case studies that give people, I guess, more of a tangible view of how the grant is calculated. Deb, I'm just thinking that, you know, we'll get through as many questions as we can, but there's so many questions that are probably relevant, so it'd be great to get an extract from this, and we can also respond to some of those questions like Tao's, where we can direct them specifically to that information.
That's a great idea, Maya.
Yeah. And similarly with the asylum seeker question that came up, we can also, you know, Britt mentioned a few programs that we'd encourage people to direct clients that they're supporting to, so we can provide some more information on that in responding to the questions.
Yeah, great, really good, really
Deb,
good.
I've also just put a link to the operational guidelines in the chat. So it's about a 30-page document, and it actually gets into the real detail of it. So just to Maya's point, feel free to have a look at those and ask us more questions if they're not clear.
Great, thank you. Now, again, just kind of integrating or bringing a few different questions in the Q&A together. There's been a few questions about what evidence a renter will need to provide to prove that they've lost income. Just wondering if you can provide some examples, please.
Alex, are you happy to speak to this one?
I am. I'm sorry, just looking at what we require. So we can either have a bank statement which demonstrates there's been a reduction in income, you know, between the period of before March and since March. If you're a sole trader and you're not actually earning income but reliant on the income from your business, then again it's a bank statement demonstrating a reduction in turnover for sole traders, or a 13-week profit and loss statement. And then if people don't have those evidentiary requirements, and in some cases they don't, then a letter from a current or previous employer that employment has ceased or income has been reduced, or working hours have been reduced will kind of do. So there does need to be some evidence, but you know, we'll look at pay slips, we'll look at anything that kind of really demonstrates that there's been a drop in income or working hours or revenue turnover in between those periods. So I'm hoping that's not going to be too much of a barrier to people, and I encourage that if you're struggling or your applicant is struggling with what the evidence requirements are, to contact our number and we can take you through what will be useful in their circumstance.
Great, thank you. Related to an earlier question just regarding renters with no income, does the eligibility criteria regarding lost income exclude people with no income?
I think it does, unless they've actually lost income. So, you know, you need to have income to lose it. So, you know, I think Brittany's point's right that inadvertently, because of the focus on this and being a response to the COVID pandemic and the fact that a large proportion of people that were already working have lost income, it probably cuts them out. So I think that's a fair observation.
Yeah. We mentioned earlier the power imbalance between landlords and renters, and so there's been a few questions about landlords refusing to grant a rent reduction. So I think we kind of addressed part of this question a little bit earlier, and I know, May, you acknowledged that it was a little unfortunate we weren't able to have our colleagues from Consumer Affairs Victoria on the call today, but they are a great team and very responsive. So as Maya said, we can take some questions offline as well. But just wondering from your team's perspective, Maya, where we hear stories about landlords refusing to grant a rent reduction, even though we know this is probably more the CAV remit, is there any advice that perhaps you could share on that? And you might not have any, but just wondering if there's anything that you might be able to share with the audience today from a DHHS perspective.
I mean, it is a little bit tricky because I think that process is a Consumer Affairs Victoria managed process, assuming that a renter and landlord can't come to an agreement themselves. That said, I mean, I think it's always helpful to hear from people if that's the experience of renters in the current market, because I think that helps, you know, build an evidence base for a changed or a more nuanced approach to what that dispute resolution scheme is. I just appreciate that's not a particularly tangible thing to say, except that, either through us or through CAV directly, we're happy to take feedback on those experiences, because I think it just builds that case for what might be more, what might be required in the system.
Great, thanks, Maya. I know that was a bit of a tricky one to put to you because it really does sit in CAV's remit. But given that there were a few questions and comments, thanks for speaking to that. And as we mentioned at the outset of this forum, this is just one of a series of forums. So we will continue to both work with the DHHS team and the Consumer Affairs Victoria team around really, getting out good information to community sector workers about the range of measures that are available and how we can support as many tenants as possible who are eligible to access support. Question as well around what people are wondering if the rent relief grant can be used for debt accrued in the last 9 months.
Look, once the rental grant is really designed to bridge the gap between a person's rent or full rent before a rent reduction agreement is in place and their current rent. Having said that, once I think the grant has been credited to the account of the tenant, would be quite flexible about how it was used, but that's really in the process, that's really in the control of the tenant, I think, and we expect the tenant and the landlord to agree about the use of the funds. But we've really been clear in the messaging that it's designed to bridge that gap between sorry, I've got a buzz in my headphones, so I can't quite hear. May, do you mind picking up?
I'll pick it up. Yeah, I think just to add to Alex's point, so that when the payment is made to the landlord or to an account that's there for rental, the rental payments. And so I suppose the scheme is structured in a way that it gets the financial assistance out. How that is then applied in the context of somebody's situation is we haven't sought to step in between that relationship. So it might be that a renter might choose to use it to bring down future payments so that then, they're paying 30% of income for the next however many months. It might also be that by the time the payment is made, there might be a lag between, for example, someone losing their job and applying for the grant, and then the grant being paid out, and it could be between that period between them applying and them losing their job that they might have accumulated rental debt. In that instance, it's completely conceivable that the renter and a landlord might come to an agreement whereby the grant is paid and it pays off the past debt.
Thanks, Maya. Question about once the rent relief grant is approved, how are the funds spent? Is the rent paid in full, or is a portion used to lower the rent cost on a week-to-week basis?
And I think this sort of relates back to the last question. In a sense, from the scheme's perspective, we pay out a lump sum. So it's calculated based on bringing the rent payment down to 30% of income. As we're seeing in many applicants, that is equating to 3,000 or close to 3,000, so the maximum grant being paid out. In terms of how that grant is then applied, that is dependent on the renter's circumstance and the agreement that they might come to with their landlord or their agent, for example. So it might be that they bring it down, it might be that they clear an accumulated debt, or it might be that, they decide to go to zero payments for the next couple of weeks and then pick up. So that structure we leave the sort of flexibility in terms of what's going to work best for renter circumstances there.
Yeah. Great, thank you. There's been a few questions asking whether there's any support during the application process. So, for example, people with low English, for example.
Yes, look, during the grant application process, we're more than happy for any support agency to support an applicant completing the application. So, I know that many of the members that are on this today do that day in, day out. So we're open to that. And we can also use the Victorian interpreting service to help as much as possible. So you know, I think the front line is probably the members on this call, but if you need help, you know, there is help on hand with the translating service.
That's terrific to know, Alex. Thank you.
And there are fact sheets in about 30 community languages available on that website. So that's not actually the application, but it does kind of explain the process in you know, main community languages.
Great, thanks for that information. Just a question, comment and a question. Many renters are now seeking an extension to a rent reduction agreement or orders, or making a fresh application as their rental reduction agreement. Is there a way they can access any remaining DHHS rent relief? Is there an expedited process?
Yes, they can apply for the balance of that maximum $3,000 if they didn't receive it the first time round. I don't think there's an expedited process, so I think you really either need to contact that number, the contact number directly, or that's probably the easiest way to do it, I think, rather than necessarily a new application.
Great, thank you. And then a question I've just noticed on the Q&A as well, Tanya York is asking, are people who pay board and lodging eligible for the grant? So this is, for example, people paying board and lodging to family or others. They may receive Commonwealth rent assistance for this. So just a question about whether that's in scope at all.
It's a really good question, Tanya, and I think the answer is generally yes, as long as they meet all of the other eligibility criteria. So we've, in designing the grant, that the government's been keen to have a really wide remit, not just in terms of the people that can apply by not having, not needing to have a citizenship, but also they can be in any type of accommodation as long as there is proof that there's a genuine accommodation arrangement. And I think in the circumstances where people are renting from family, then would need, you know, would need sufficient proof that a genuine relationship, rental relationship exists in that matter.
Great, thank you. Just a question from a little earlier. I'm just scrolling back to the Q&A just to scoop up any questions that we missed earlier on. So a question about, with the grant, is this in addition to accessing HEF, so the Housing Establishment Fund, and rent assistance from the access point?
That's a really good question, and the answer is yes. They're not linked really. So we kind of generally expect that people would apply for one or the other, but there may be circumstances in which people are eligible for both.
Yeah, great.
And yeah, it's so the CRA stuff will only kind of factor in potentially on income, but probably on how much of their income they're paying on rent.
Yeah, great. Now we're seeing a lot of questions in the Q&A as well about informal tenures, things like overcrowded student accommodation, subletting. I might ask a question from Melinda that is an example of some of the types of questions we're getting in the Q&A. So Melinda's made the point that many international students live in crowded share homes with informal rental arrangements. And sometimes the rental agreements are in text messages only, there's no formal paperwork. And so Melinda's asking, can they access this grant?
Yeah, again, that's a really good question. We've met quite a few times with Students Victoria and some of the international student bodies to try and work through the circumstances of international students and how we can make sure that the grant reaches them. I think it's a tricky thing, right? So really to kind of to be fair and reasonable with the grant, we need to make sure that there's a genuine rental relationship. So a text message may not cut that. You know, I think it needs to be probably something that's even if it wasn't in writing at the time, that is confirmed in writing or through a stat dec after the event. I know that kind of puts a slight additional burden on these very informal and you know, sometimes vulnerable rental relationships, but I think it's important that we do kind of make sure that there's a proper accommodation relationship in place. So we're quite happy to be as responsive as possible to the individual circumstances of international students. And I think if you're in doubt or not sure, then please contact the contact number, and that can help you work out what's appropriate evidentiary requirements for the situation of an individual student.
Great, thank you.
I think just to come back on that, because there's been a few questions around whether it's insecure or informal arrangements. I think in structuring the scheme, we've tried to be as wide-reaching as possible and have flexibility within the eligibility criteria to really capture as many vulnerable renters as possible. I think that's, obviously needs to be balanced with the integrity and kind of probity requirements across the scheme. So it will often come back to those evidentiary requirements and making sure that they meet a threshold by which there is comfort that it's an appropriate payment to be made.
Yeah, thanks, Maya. And just noting, there's an earlier comment or question in the chat, which I think is a similar, in a similar vein. It's not so much about those kind of informal, living arrangements or renting arrangements, but around that issue of like people perhaps in insecure work, people earning cash in hand. So similarly, a question about what if a tenant was earning cash in hand prior to their job loss? They're unable to provide a separation letter from their employer, and asking would that exclude them from accessing the grant. So just noting your comments, Maya, around the evidentiary requirements, your team's, the balancing act of ensuring kind of the integrity of the process and of the scheme, but also ensuring kind of equity of access and addressing kind of community needs. So yeah, similar question there around people earning cash in hand, and would that exclude them from accessing the grant if they were unable to provide a separation letter? Is there anything else that you would kind of want to add in that regard, Maya, or Alex or Brittany?
I think it's probably similar to what I detailed before, which is, there does need to be some level of evidence. But I think just going back to what Alex mentioned, where somebody is in doubt, we would encourage them to call or contact us and then talk through what those evidentiary requirements are specific to their circumstance. Because, as we said, we're keen to make sure that this is as far-reaching as possible. We just need to strike that right balance to make sure that there's integrity in terms of the payment administration.
Thank you. Yeah, and just want to commend you on that kind of very kind of, I guess, fair and just approach that the team is taking. Now, I'm conscious of time. We are due to finish up shortly. Just probably a couple more questions before we finish up. And as we said, we will have a record of all the questions asked and look at a way of addressing anything that we weren't able to get to today. But it's been a really engaging session. So question around if someone received the grant and then moves house, what happens to the unused funds?
Alex, did you want to take this one? There's been. Yeah,
absolutely. And look, I think this has been a really interesting example of the tension between wanting to make sure funds go to people that need it and making sure that funds don't necessarily travel with people when they don't need it. So where we've got to currently is that that if there's money left over at the end of a tenancy agreement, once you've settled with the landlord on all outstanding stuff, if the grant was paid kind of, I think, after the end of September, then we would generally expect the landlord and tenant to agree to pay that money back. So there might be a small proportion of the grant left over. But if that person is kind of moving on to another tenancy, then we can probably fast track, reconsidering how that money is used. So in general, we would expect it to be paying out all arrears and outstanding debts, and if there's any money left over, return back to the fund.
Great, thank you. So we're at 10:58. We're due to finish up now. Can I just thank everyone for attending? We were just blown away by the level of interest in this session, and really appreciate you all got very busy jobs. Appreciate you making the time to join us this morning. We really hope it's been useful. We'd love you to answer some survey questions at the end. And really, we recognise that we've got a great kind of package of supports, assistance available to renters in Victoria right now, and we absolutely recognise the important role, the key role that community sector workers make in amplifying that message, letting people know what's available out there for them, and connecting them to those resources and support. So thank you to all our community sector heroes. We really appreciate the partnership with you. Really want to thank Maya, Alex and Brittany. Like, what a fantastic team. Very smart, switched on people, and I think we covered a lot of ground today. So thank you for joining with us for this session. It will be the first of many kind of points of engagement between the different teams across government and VCOSS with the sector to make sure that you have all the best information to hand. So thank you very much. Please complete the surveys. The survey questions pop up on your screen, and please continue to look out for more events and information as part of the VCOSS Renters' Rights Rundown. Really like to thank Consumer Affairs Victoria for their support in helping us to put this on as well. So thanks everyone. Have a great day, and we'll enjoy catching up with you again in the near future. Thank you everyone.
Thank you.